Hello viewers, today we're going to be looking at the second lecture in a three-part series on the Canaanites and the Ugarites. Today's topic is taking the previous chronology of the Canaanites and applying it more concentratedly on the city-state of Ugarit, in particular preparing for next week where we will be diving into the mythological texts and how those relate to the Bible. So, without further ado, let's begin. Week 2. Ugarit is Canaanite by culture, and its relationship to other Canaanite cities is therefore not in the biblical or geographic sense of the word, right? So Ugarit is located to the east of Cyprus, which places it extremely north of the traditional biblical boundaries of the land of Canaan. However, because of the religious and cultural similarities between the Israelite religion and the Ugaritic mythological text has been culturally adopted into the term Canaanite. Although the city-state of Ugarit is very northern to be classified as a Canaanite city, its mythological text and its cosmopolitan culture that arose because of its status as a port city compensate for this geographical anomaly. The main scholarly focus among the findings at Ugarit has doubtlessly been the relationship between the Ugaritic El and the biblical Elohim, which we'll cover later on in this presentation. By comparison with most cultures in the whole of the ancient Near East, the two common factors that show most clearly the deep antiquity of Ugaritic religion are its cult of ancestor worship and the bovine structure of its pantheon. It's repeating the themes we covered in last week, so that you see it's not just a broad sense of applying to the Canaanites, but that also can be applied to the Ugarites more specifically. I defend the argument that from the perspective of Neolithic West Semitic peoples, it was natural to believe that the cattle herd could represent a structural template which they could project onto their pantheon in order to understand how the gods and goddesses of their religion related to one another. Similarly, the primary writings from the Ugaritic ancestral cult show philological evidence which supports some continuity of belief among the Israelites, and the archaeological record has also provided a link to the cult's Neolithic origin. Okay, now let's look at the excavation of Ugarit. Ugarit is positioned on the Mediterranean coast of Syria, just east of Cyprus, in the Minat el-Baida, or White Harbor, named for the color of the stones of the shore facing the sea. It is in the area today known as Ras Shamra, meaning fennel-headed hill. The land holding of the kingdom of Ugarit was a small coastal strip, so that the kingdom itself is best classified as a city-state. Its boundaries stretched from Jebel Akra, known to the Ugarites as Mount Safon, in the north, to the border of Tel Sucas in the south, and the Nahar al-Kabir, or Big River, tended to form its eastern border, although these boundaries may have extended from time to time. The first excavations in 1928 were the result of a farmer from the Burj al-Qasib, whose plow struck in ancient stone. The farmer had found antiquities in his land before, prompting him to seek out the governor of the territory, who then reported to the academic organization. in French, these services of antiquities from Syria and the Levant. They excavated the necropolis in the site, which in itself was not significant to the area. The findings were taken to the Louvre, where the keeper of the Department of Oriental Antiquities, René Dussault, suggested that this might be a graveyard of a Cretan colony, and to carry out further excavations in the Tel Ras Shamra, or Fennel-Headed Hill, which was nearby. The excavations were carried out by Claude F.A. Schaeffer of the Academy of Inscriptions and Belles-Lettres in Paris in 1929. After the initial necropolis had been fully excavated, the preliminary digging revealed two main sections of a site which had remains from the Neolithic to the Roman periods. The seaward section was mostly pottery and animal bones, no traces of human habitations. The other inland-facing half contained vaulted tombs, religious objects such as the Horus idol and the Baal idol, which show pharaonic headdresses, show significant cultural influence from Egyptian trade. So again, they're putting the pharaonic headdress on their own gods, which shows influence from Egyptian trade. After World War II, the site was divided into 4 basic strata, but although several strata go beyond this timeline into the Roman period, but that is beyond the use of the city by Ugaritic government. The decipherment of the Ugaritic language. The necropolis ceased to be used after the city was destroyed at the beginning of the Iron Age. Schaeffer and Virouillot found a tablet towards the end of 1931 with the phrase, Nakmad Melik Egert. Which was easily translated by the cognate Melik for king. We have Nakmad, king of Ugarit. Egert is a more native way of pronouncing the English word Ugarit. This translation confirmed the city's identity as Ugarit, which was a city frequently mentioned in the Egyptians' Tel El Amarna trade records, which explained the city's wealth as a harbor for trade routes across Syria. The language was deciphered relatively quickly after it was discovered to be Semitic, and the alphabetical lists of symbols were in basically the same order as Hebrew with some exceptions. So for example, there are 3 or 4 ways of writing the letter Aleph in Ugaritic, where there's only one way in Hebrew. Dr. H. Bauer and Dr. E. Dornwa both worked independently, but it was Virouillot who published the first translation of what would become known as the Baal cycle, called the Epic of Elian and Mot in 1931. Curtis dates these mythological epics to approximately 1400 to 1350 BC. These were the only known native works on the Canaanite religion. It is also valuable as a cultural link closer to the commonly used Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts available at the time. Most scholars today agree that there was a certain amount of give and take between the Canaanite and early Israelite religions, but Ugarit's physical distance and date of destruction makes direct influence possible so that only indirect notions of cultural ideas can be known. For example, it's not until after the destruction of the sites of many of these Canaanite cities by the Sea Peoples and the rise of ancient Israel that we see how these ideas in the Ugaritic texts were inherited by the coming of the Israelite culture. Cuneiform tablets began being discovered on May 4th, 1929. Some were in other languages of the region besides Ugaritic. The Ugaritic language was by no means confined to the kingdom of Ugarit itself and has been discovered in a variety of other Canaanite sites as well. The closest of these sites are Ibn Hani, Tel Sukkos, Tel Nebi Mend, also known as Kadesh. In Lebanon, a jar handle from Kamed El Loz and the neck from a jar from Sarafend have both been discovered with Ugaritic inscriptions. In Israel, there are also Ugaritic tablets that have been found in Beth Shemesh, Tanakh, and an inscribed dagger has been discovered near Mount Tabor. Some scholars still classify Ugarit as an Amorite culture instead of a Canaanite culture. Okay. This is a minority opinion among scholars of Ugarit, that Ugarit is not a Canaanite language. It is instead an Amorite language. Okay. Now they do this by asserting that the idea of a cosmopolitan port city has been overly exaggerated by proponents of the Canaanite thesis, and that Ugarit fits with the migration pattern of moving north before east of the Amorite people before they invaded Babylon. The majority of the relevant texts were discovered in the high priest's library inside his living space, which was situated between the two major temples of the city, one to Baal and the other to Dagon. The proper scriptorium for between the two major temples of the city, one to Baal and the other to Dagon. The proper scriptorium for training purposes is believed to be in the royal palace, where the tables of alphabets and word lists were discovered in abundance. Other houses that contained libraries were those of tax collectors. The area around the temples of Baal and Dagon, separate from the priest's abode, were many poorer houses crammed together around narrow streets. Ugarit shared in the market for purple dye, along with Tyre, which had been produced locally in Tyre from the shell of the murex snail. Other industries of Ugarit included wine and scented oils. Trading partners included Egypt, Assyria, Aegean peoples, Cyprus, and the Hittites. Now, who is Dagon? Dagon was an agricultural deity who looked half man, half fish. Now, the other instance that we see use of the word of the god Dagon is in the Bible, in the story of Samson, where the Philistines' temple to Dagon was destroyed by Samson, and subsequently took his own life in that destruction. Now, The story of Samson is interesting because it shows the archetypal story of the solar hero. Solar hero. Now, Samson, or Shun in Hebrew, comes from the root shamash, which refers to things referring to the sun. Delilah is using the dalet as a preposition referring to Lila, which is the night. Now, the death of Samson shows how the night overtakes the sun. We see this theme also appears in the story of Enkidu, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, Enkidu is a solar hero in the same way as Samson because he is a wild man, very hairy, wild man, who is not part of the civilized world until after he has sex with the priestess of Ishtar known as Samhat. Okay, and she brings him into the civilized world with sex. And then, but later on in the story, when Enkidu offended Ishtar, offended Ishtar by shaking the haunches of the bull of heaven in her direction. Now, not the priestess of Ishtar, but the god Ishtar strikes him dead with a horrible disease. So we see again how powerful women overtake wild men by using their feminine charms. That is the story of the solar hero archetype. The history of Ugarit's golden age. During the later half of the 15th century BC, the pharaohs of Egypt negotiated with the Mitanni Hurrians for control over the city of Ugarit and the Canaanite coast. Eventually, when the Hittites rose to power during the close of that century, they chose to invade the Mitanni before expanding into Egyptian Canaan. Therefore, that period of time from the 14th century BC, when the Hurrians and the Hittites were at war, was a long peace for Ugarit, commonly known as its golden age. Ugarit changes hands so many times over its political history that this time in which Egypt was able to hold Ugarit while no one else was going to war with Egypt counts as a golden age. Ugarit's king list dates from this time, showing the beginning of the kingdom's interest in constructing its own historical record. Although earlier kings of Ugarit are known as far back as circa 1700 BC, and the site was doubtlessly inhabited as far back as the Neolithic, the precise lengths and dates of their reigns are unknown, so it is only after 1400 BC that a clear chronology exists. The kings of the Golden Age of Ugarit remain as tributaries to Egypt through the reign of Amenhotep III, 1353 to 1351 BC. The history of the kings of the Golden Age Ugarit as tributaries to Egypt. Nickmadu II was most likely the king of Ugarit during the time at which the city's epic poetry was committed to writing, although those poems existed in oral form for many generations previous. The reign of Nickmadu I and II are difficult to distinguish because the colophon of the tablets CTA 4 and 6 do not give the suffix number. However, the reign of Nickmadu II was most likely between the Great Earthquake and sometime contemporary with the reign of the Hittite king Shupaladumish, which Curtis estimates to 1360, from 1360 to circa 1330 BC. It was during this time that Egypt lost the city of Ugarit to the Hittites as a result of Akhenaten's negligence of his tribute, without any protest from the Egyptian side at all. The result of Akhenaten's negligence of his Canaanite colonies for the sake of promoting optimism in Egypt, Ugarit was taken by treaty and tribute without any protest from the Egyptian side at all. Nickmadu was succeeded by his second son Nickmepa, and after his first son Arhalbu, who had died and bequeathed his wife to his brother Nickmepa, so that the dynasty might continue as unbroken as possible. Nickmepa's reign is believed to have lasted for at least the remainder of the 14th century BC after circa 1330 BC. Ugarit was overrun by a confederacy of tribespeople wielding iron weapons, known to the Egyptian sources as the Sea Peoples, during the close of the 12th century BC. These Sea Peoples are believed to have contained the Philistines as one of their confederates. Letters from the kings of Byblos to Tyre from the same period do not give any information relating to the turmoil in Ugarit, which may explain how these cities, famous for their piracy, survived the coming of the Sea Peoples by giving tribute for their safety. A relationship between El and the God of the Bible. The biblical Elohim acknowledges in conversation with Moses that he has appeared to different prophets under different names, including El Shaddai. Exodus 6, verses 2 to 3. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. Right? So El Shaddai, according to the scholar Coogan, can be more properly translated as El of the mountain. Therefore, following this logic, the mountain should be a reference to Mount Zaphon, on which the Canaanite El was believed to have lived. El is frequently called by the epithet bull in Ugaritic Tur or Iber in order to emphasize his strength and his patrimony, which corresponds to the accounts of Yahweh, where he is given by the title Ibir, meaning bull in Hebrew, and with the same connotations as the Ugaritic cognate equivalent. Therefore, the common translation used in the case of Genesis 49:24 as the mighty one of Jacob can be better understood as the bull of Jacob. The blessing of Joseph by his father Jacob calls Joseph the archer whose bow stayed taut and his arms were made firm by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, which is reminiscent of Akkad's blessed bow. And with that, let's continue on to section D, relation of the epic text Akkad to the ancestor skull cult and other Canaanite cities. We're going to be taking a brief look at one of the major mythological poems called the Akkad epic, and probably return to a more broader understanding of where it fits within the three mythological texts in our next lecture. This is just a preview. Okay. Before we get too far into the epic, let's consider the genealogy of the gods, and I'll leave this up here for reference until I use the board again. This is the basic sense of where the major Ugaritic and Canaanite gods sit. Daniel, the protagonist of the Akkad epic, has no son and so beseeches Baal for 7 days to intercede with El that Daniel may father a child with his wife and is successful. Then there is a break for 2 full columns in the text. It resumes with the new child Akkad receiving a magical bow and arrows from the craftsman god Kothar Wahasis, and the event is celebrated with a feast. He receives the bow and arrows, but there is a break in the text, presumably when Akkad does not offer a proper sacrifice to Baal. The text resumes at a feast where Anat offers Akkad immortality in exchange for his bow and arrows, but Akkad rebukes her, saying that he is prepared to share the fate of all mankind, death, in a sense. The next tablet is also poorly preserved. The end of the tablet tells Anat gained permission from El to kill Akkad with her assassin Yatpan, who kills Akkad by transforming into a bird, lifting him far up into the sky and then dropping him to his death. The next section tells how the land had suffered because of Akkad's bow being broken, and how Daniel mourns the death of his son. When he learns how Akkad was killed by Anat, Daniel beseeches Baal to allow him to tear birds out of the sky and search for Akkad's remains. When no remains are found, Baal resurrects the birds. Later he finds the remains of his son inside Sumul, the mother of the eagles, and gives the proper funerary rites. When Daniel returns home, his daughter Pukat is charged with the quest of killing Yatpan, but the text breaks off before the resolution of the battle. Now let's return to the Neolithic trends in this story of Akkad. The establishment of a firm link in religious beliefs between Bronze Age Ugarit and Neolithic Canaanite peoples has taken decades of archaeological verification by comparing the skull relics from Canaanite ancestor cults to passages from the Akkad text. Margalit has utilized the previous philological work of Ginsburg and Kenyon's analysis of burial customs in Neolithic Jericho in order to understand the meaning of the passage from Akkad, in which Akkad gives his retort to Anat, turning down her offer of immortality in exchange for his bow, saying, "Glaze will be poured upon my head, plaster upon my pate, and I'll die as everyone dies." Ginsburg argued, Proverbs 26:23. Proverbs 26:23. Glaze laid over earthenware are odd in lips with an evil mind. Okay, so that first word is commonly translated as glaze, as in the passage from Akkad, glaze will be poured upon my head. Now, just gonna leave that there. Ginsburg argued that the Ugaritic word SPSG can be identified by the Hebrew cognate found in Proverbs 26:23 that I just read, which is sapsagim, which translates as glaze. However, it was only later by the work of a scholar called Good that a connection was made between the verse from Akkad and the plastered skulls recovered by Kenyon from Jericho in 1958. Indicating the possibility that Akkad was referencing the same Neolithic burial custom, which in Jericho was utilized as a form of ancestor worship. However, many years would still pass in order for enough plastered skulls to be excavated in order to prove that the religious practice described at Jericho was not an isolated phenomenon. Good's argument would not receive major scholarly debate until the early 1970s, when the plastered skulls at Jericho were proved not to be unique to the city. By that time, similar ancestral relics had been discovered at Tel Ramad, the western Hula Valley, and Ain Ghazal. Additionally, there are lines which contain parts of a monologue given by Anath after the death of Akkad, during which time she begins preparing his cadaver for a proper burial. The translation of these fragments, referring to how Anath prepared Akkad's cadaver, indicate that she removed all of his teeth. Similarly, the work of Struhal, who in 1973 determined that all of the known plastered skulls excavated with jaws intact, none of those possessed any teeth. The fact that the continuation of the ancestor skull ritual has not been observed contemporary with the Bronze Age Ugarit means that the author of the Akkad text was making use of the deliberate archaizing in order to heighten the drama of the epic setting. Or conversely, that these passages occur in the Akkad epic because of the deep antiquity of the oral tradition that was drawn upon in order to commit the epic to writing. Thank you, and this concludes our second week's lecture. Thank you for tuning in.